They told her a long time ago that love could cross a river, but it could never cross a history written in dust and blood, and still she found herself walking back to that same stretch of creek every evening, boots sinking half an inch into the soft mud, the smell of warm earth and horse leather hanging in the air, because he would be there, the quiet cowboy who never asked her name and never offered his, a man who spoke in pauses instead of words, who fixed broken fence posts like they mattered more than people, who tipped his hat not out of habit, but out of something quieter, something older, and the first time he handed her a canteen, he waited until she drank before lifting it to his own lips, a small thing, almost nothing, but in her world, small things were the only things that told the truth, and she noticed how he kept his distance, never stepping closer than 10 feet unless she moved first, never reaching unless she nodded, as if he understood lines that most men pretended not to see, and the wind would move through the dry grass around them, carrying the sound of distant cattle and the creak of wood, and they would stand there in that silence that wasn't empty, just unfinished, and she hated how easy it became to stay, how her steps slowed when she should have turned away, how her eyes began to search for him even before she reached the bend in the creek, because men like him were not supposed to exist, not where she came from, not after what had been taken, and yet there he was, sleeves rolled, hands rough, eyes steady but never demanding, like he carried something heavier than regret and had learned to live with it without letting it spill over. And one evening, as the sun dropped low enough to turn the land gold, she saw him standing still, not working, not moving, just looking out across the ridge like the land itself was speaking to him in a language he couldn't quite answer. And something in that stillness unsettled her more than anger ever could, because it didn't look like ownership. It looked like debt, like a man waiting for something he didn't deserve, and she should have left then, should have remembered the stories, the warnings, the names carved into memory like scars, but instead she stayed, one more minute, then another, until the silence between them felt less like distance, and more like a question neither of them knew how to ask, and somewhere deep beneath that quiet, something had already begun to shift, something neither of them could take back once it found its way into the light. The next morning came in slow, the kind of light that stretches across the land before the sun fully decides to rise. And Aiyana had not meant to return. She told herself that as she walked, counting each step like it might turn her back, 100 yards, then another, boots brushing dry grass that whispered against her ankles. But something had settled in her chest the night before, not peace, not trust, something quieter and more dangerous, curiosity. And when she reached the creek bend, he was already there, same place, same stillness, as if he had not moved since she left, as if time bent differently around him. And he nodded once when he saw her, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging that she had made a choice he had expected but would never ask for. And she noticed the small details again, the way his horse stood 10 feet back without a rope, the way his hands rested open at his sides, never near his belt, never near anything that could be mistaken for threat. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the sound of water moving over stone filling the space between them, until she stepped closer than she had before, 5 feet now, close enough to see the faint lines around his eyes, the kind that come from squinting into sunlight for too many years, and she said, "You come here every day?" Not a question, more like an observation she already knew the answer to, and he gave a small shrug, looking for something that might still be here, his voice low, steady, like it had been worn smooth over time, and she frowned slightly because that did not sound like a man checking fences or counting cattle. That sounded like a man searching for something he had lost without ever holding it. And she glanced past him toward the open stretch of land beyond the ridge, miles of it, dry and wide, and carrying the weight of stories no one spoke out loud anymore. And something in her tightened, because she knew that land, not by name, but by feeling, the kind of place that holds memory in the ground itself. And she said quietly, "That land does not belong to you." And for the first time, he did not answer right away, his jaw shifting slightly as he followed her gaze. And when he finally spoke, it was softer than before, "I know." And the words did not sound like denial. They sounded like agreement, like confession, without asking for forgiveness. And that unsettled her more than anger would have, because she had been ready for excuses, ready for distance, ready for the same wall she had seen in every other man who stood on land that was not theirs. But he gave her none of that, only a quiet acceptance that sat heavy in the air between them, and she studied him longer now, searching for the lie that had to be there, because nothing about this made sense, not the way he spoke, not the way he stood, not the way he looked at land like it might answer back. And she realized something then that made her chest tighten in a way she did not like. She did not know who he was, not really. And worse than that, she was starting to care, and that was the one mistake her people had taught her never to make. By the third day, the silence between them had begun to change shape. No longer something that separated them, but something that held them in place, like the space between two hills where wind gathers before it moves on. And Aiyana noticed it the moment she saw him again, not at the creek this time, but further up the ridge where the ground turned dry and brittle underfoot, where the grass gave way to dust, and old fence posts leaned like tired men who had seen too many seasons. And he was working there, steady, deliberate, fixing a line that had long since stopped keeping anything in or out, and she slowed without meaning to, watching from a distance that felt safer than the one she had been keeping before, because something in her had begun to shift, and she did not trust it. Not yet. Not enough to stand close without questions, and he saw her before she spoke. He always did, straightening just slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, like he had already counted on her being there. And she stepped closer, careful with each footfall, until the dry earth crunched softly beneath her boots. And she said, "You are fixing a fence that does not hold anything." And he glanced down at the wood in his hands, running his fingers along a crack that had split years ago. Maybe it is not supposed to hold anything anymore, and that answer stayed with her longer than it should have, because it did not sound like a man repairing property. It sounded like a man letting something go without saying it out loud. And she moved closer still, close enough now to see the sweat darkening the fabric at his collar, to hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing, steady, unforced, like he had learned how to carry weight without letting it show. And for a moment she forgot the distance she was meant to keep, forgot the stories that had shaped her caution, because there was something about him that did not ask for trust, but made space for it. And that was more dangerous than any threat she had ever known. And her eyes drifted again toward the land beyond the ridge, that wide stretch of earth that felt familiar in a way she could not explain. And this time she stepped past him without asking, moving toward the highest point where the view opened fully, miles and miles of ground stretching out under the pale sky, and her breath caught slightly, not because of the beauty, but because of the feeling, something deep and quiet that settled in her chest like recognition, and she whispered, almost to herself, "My mother used to speak of this place," and behind her, he went still, the kind of stillness that carries more weight than movement ever could, and she turned back slowly, watching his face, the way his eyes had shifted, not in fear, not in denial, but in something closer to acceptance, like a truth he had been waiting for had finally found its way into the open, and she felt it then, clear and sharp, the thread that had been pulling at her since the first moment she saw him. The reason he looked at this land like it did not belong to him. And she asked, quieter now but stronger, "Who are you when you stand on this ground?" And the wind moved through the broken fence between them, carrying dust into the air, and for the first time, he did not look at her when he answered, just out across the land that stretched far beyond either of them. Someone who was trying to return something he never had the right to keep. The words stayed between them long after the wind carried the dust away, not loud, not heavy, but impossible to ignore, and Aiyana felt something inside her shift in a way she could not name, because men did not speak like that about land, not men who wore boots worn from riding it, not men who fixed fences instead of tearing them down. And yet here he was, standing with his hands empty, looking out over miles that should have belonged to someone else. And she took a slow step back, not out of fear, but to see him clearer, to understand the shape of him against everything she had been taught. And she said, "You speak like a man who knows this ground is not his." And this time he did look at her, not quickly, not defensively, just steady, like he had been waiting for her to say it. "My father believed land could be owned if you put your name on paper," he said, voice quiet but firm. "I learned too late that paper does not change what the ground remembers." And she felt the air tighten, slightly at those words, because they sounded too close to truth, too close to something her own elders had said beside fires that no longer burned. And she watched him carefully now, the way his shoulders carried no pride, only weight. The way he stood not like a man claiming anything, but like someone standing in the wrong place for too long. And she asked, "Why are you still here then, if you know it is not yours?" And he exhaled slowly, eyes drifting past her toward the broken fence line. "Because leaving would be easier, and I have done enough of that already." And that answer landed deeper than she expected, because it did not sound like defense. It sounded like a man refusing the simplest escape, and she turned her gaze back to the land, letting the silence stretch again. But this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but filled with something neither of them had spoken yet. And she reached into the small pouch at her side, pulling out the worn leather cord that held the only thing she had carried from her past, a small carved bead smoothed by years of touch. And she held it in her palm without offering it, just letting it rest there between them. "My mother said this land listens," she said softly, not looking at him. She said it remembers who walks on it with respect, and who walks on it like they have already forgotten. And when she finally lifted her eyes, she saw something change in him, not relief, not hope, something quieter, like recognition finding its place. And he nodded once, almost to himself. "I believe that," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to earn her trust, just a simple truth offered without expectation. And the distance between them, once measured in feet and caution, felt smaller now, not gone, not forgotten, but shifting, like a line in the dust that the wind had begun to erase. And Aiyana realized with a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than anything else. This was no longer just about land, and whatever stood between them now could not be solved by walking away. The sun sat higher now, burning the edges of the sky into a pale white that flattened shadows and left nowhere to hide. And still neither of them moved away, as if stepping back would mean losing something neither had agreed to name. And Aiyana closed her fingers slowly around the small bead in her palm, the worn surface pressing into her skin like a reminder that not everything carried forward was meant to be given away. And she slipped it back into her pouch, without ceremony, without explanation, because some things were not meant to be seen yet, not even by someone who stood this close. And when she looked up again, he was watching her, not the bead, not her hands, just her face, steady, patient, like he understood that what mattered was not what she held, but what she chose to reveal. And that unsettled her in a way she could not explain, because men usually looked for advantage, for signs, for weakness. But he looked like he was waiting for permission that he would never ask for. And she shifted her weight slightly, the dry earth cracking softly beneath her boot. "You still have not told me your name," she said, not sharp, not demanding, just placing the words between them like something that needed to be acknowledged. And he took a breath before answering. Not long, but enough to show that the answer mattered. "Elias," he said, and the name settled into the air with a quiet weight. Simple, unadorned, and she repeated it once in her mind without saying it aloud, testing the shape of it, deciding whether it belonged to the man in front of her. And after a moment, she nodded slightly. "Aiyana," she replied, offering her own name not as trust, but as balance. And something shifted again, subtle but real, like a door opening just enough to let light through without revealing what lay beyond. And Elias inclined his head once, not smiling, not stepping closer, just acknowledging what had been given. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt less like history and more like choice. And then he reached slowly into his coat, movement deliberate, visible, the way a man moves when he knows every gesture can be misunderstood. And he pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, handled too many times to be something new. And he held it out halfway between them without stepping forward, not offering it directly, just placing it in the space they shared. "You asked who I am on this land," he said quietly. "This is part of that answer." And she did not take it right away, her eyes moving from the paper to his face, searching for the reason behind the gesture, for the cost hidden inside it, because nothing given so carefully came without weight. And the wind stirred again, lifting the edge of the paper slightly, and she could see faint lines across it, markings that looked like boundaries, like divisions drawn by hands that had never walked the ground they claimed. And her chest tightened without warning, because she knew what it was before she even touched it. And slowly, Cautiously, she reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the page, and when she took it, the paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than ink, like it carried decisions made long before either of them stood here. And she unfolded it just enough to see the name printed across the top, Whitaker Ranch, and the world seemed to narrow for a moment, not in sound, not in sight, but in feeling, everything pulling inward toward that single word, and she looked up at him again, eyes sharper now, voice quieter but cutting through the space between them. You knew, she said, not asking, not accusing, just stating the truth. As it revealed itself, and Elias did not look away, did not defend, did not step back, he simply nodded once, slow and certain. I did. And the wind moved again, carrying dust between them, and for the first time since she had met him, the silence felt different, no longer a place of understanding, but a line that had just been drawn, and neither of them moved to erase it. The word hung there longer than it should have, not loud, not sharp, just heavy enough to settle into the space between them, and Aiyana felt her fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the paper, the dry texture pressing against her skin as if it could anchor her to something steady. But nothing about this felt steady anymore, not the land beneath her feet, not the man standing in front of her, not even the quiet she had begun to trust, and she folded the paper once, slow and deliberate, not to accept it, not to reject it, but to keep it from spreading wider than she could hold. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, not raised, not angry, just clearer, like something inside her had drawn a line she could finally see. You let me stand here not knowing. And Elias did not move, did not step closer or away. He simply met her eyes with the same steady stillness. I let you decide who I was before the land did, he said, and that answer landed in a place she had not expected. Because it was not a defense, not an excuse. It was something quieter, something that asked for nothing and explained everything at the same time. And she looked past him again, out toward the ridge, toward the stretch of ground that had begun to feel familiar in ways she could no longer ignore, and the wind carried a dry scent across it, something old, something that had been waiting. And she realized then that this moment had been coming long before she ever saw his face, long before she ever heard his voice. It had been written into the land itself, waiting for someone to stand here and understand it. And she exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest shifting, not gone, not softened, just changing shape. And she asked, quieter now, but more certain, why show me this at all? And this time, Elias did not answer right away, his gaze dropping briefly to the folded paper in her hand, then lifting back to her. Because you were already standing on it, he said, and the truth in that felt undeniable, because she had been, not just today, not just yesterday, but every time she returned to that creek, every time she chose not to walk away, she had stepped further into something she did not yet understand, and the realization settled into her slowly, like the sun lowering toward the horizon, steady and impossible to stop, and she felt the weight of it, not as anger, not as betrayal, but as something more complicated, something that did not fit the story she had been told, and she took a small step back, not to leave, not yet, but to see him again with all of it in place, the name, the land, the truth that sat between them now. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence returning, but different now, no longer empty, no longer safe, but honest in a way that left nowhere to hide. And Aiyana understood then that whatever came next would not be decided by the past alone. And that was the part that frightened her most, because for the first time, the choice was hers. The choice did not come all at once, it settled slowly, like dust after a long ride. And Aiyana stood there with the folded paper in her hand, feeling its weight not in ounces but in everything it carried, names, lines, decisions made by men who never asked the land what it wanted. And she looked at Elias again, not as the quiet man by the creek, not as the one who handed her water without speaking, but as the man who stood in the middle of something that should have broken him or hardened him. And yet he stood unchanged, not claiming, not denying, just present in a way that felt almost impossible. And she realized that what unsettled her was not what he owned, but what he refused to become because of it. And she turned slightly, letting her eyes move across the ridge once more, measuring the distance, the silence, the history that stretched farther than either of them could walk in a single day. and she spoke without looking at him. If I walk away now, nothing changes, and the words were not a question. They were a truth she had already tested in her mind, and behind her, Elias remained still, not answering, not interrupting, because this was not his moment to shape, and she continued, slower now. If I stay, then something has to, and that was where the uncertainty lived, not in him, not in the land, but in herself, because staying meant stepping into something that had no clear ending, no promise of balance, no guarantee that the past would loosen its hold, and she closed her eyes for a brief second, feeling the wind brush across her face, carrying the dry warmth of the same land her mother had spoken of in quiet voices, the same land she had been told to remember but never expect to see again. And when she opened them, her gaze was steadier, not resolved, but willing, and she stepped forward, closing the space between them to less than 3 feet, closer than she had ever allowed, and she held the folded paper out toward him, not pushing it back, not handing it over, just holding it between them. You said you were trying to return something, she said, voice low but firm. Then do not give it to me. And for the first time, something shifted visibly in Elias. Not surprise, not confusion, but something deeper, something that looked like the ground beneath him had moved in a way he had not expected. And she met his eyes fully now. Do not place it in my hands like it is finished, she continued. Let it be something we decide, not something you fix alone. And the words settled into the air with a quiet strength, because they carried neither forgiveness nor rejection, only a refusal to let the past be rewritten by a single act. And Elias looked at her for a long moment, really looked, as if seeing her not just as someone standing on the land, but as someone who understood it in a way he had been trying to learn, and slowly, without hesitation, he lowered his hand, not taking the paper back, not moving it forward, just letting it remain where it was, between them, unclaimed, and the wind moved again across the ridge, softer this time, carrying the faintest sense of something shifting, not in the land itself, but in the space between two people who had finally stopped standing on opposite sides of it. The paper remained between them, unmoving, untouched by either hand, as if the land itself had decided it would no longer be passed like an object from one person to another, and Aiyana felt the weight of that choice settle into her bones, not heavy in the way of burden, but steady, like something finally standing where it belonged, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the wind soft now, carrying only the faint sound of dry grass shifting across the ridge, and Elias lowered his gaze. Briefly, not in retreat, not in uncertainty, but in thought, the kind that comes when a man realizes the path ahead is no longer his to walk alone. And when he looked back at her, there was something different in his eyes, not relief, not resolution, but recognition, like he had finally reached a place he had been searching for without knowing what it looked like. And he said quietly, "Then we begin with the truth." And the words did not sound like a plan. They sounded like a promise that had no shape yet. And Aiyana studied him carefully, measuring not the words, but the way he held them, the way he did not rush to explain, did not try to make them easier than they were. And she nodded once, small but certain, because truth was not something given, it was something faced, and she stepped past him then, moving toward the ridge again, not leaving, not turning away, just shifting her place in the same space. And he followed a step behind, not leading, not directing, just walking beside her, without closing the distance she had chosen. And together they stood looking out over the land, not as owner and outsider, not as past and present, but as two people seeing it clearly for the first time at the same moment. And Aiyana spoke again, softer now, but with a clarity that did not waver. My people walked this ground without fences, without lines, without names written on paper, and she glanced back at the broken posts behind them, the wood weathered and leaning, more memory than boundary, and she continued, if it is to change, it cannot look like this again. And Elias followed her gaze, taking in the same broken line, and he nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, as if he had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And he stepped forward then, reaching for one of the loose boards, not to fix it, not to restore what had been, but to lift it free from the post entirely. And the wood came away easily, as if it had been waiting to fall for years. And he set it down beside him without force, without ceremony, just removing it from the place it no longer belonged. And Aiyana watched him, not with approval, not with doubt, but with a quiet awareness that this was not an act of repair, it was an act of letting go, and the space where the board had been left a gap, small, almost unnoticeable, but real, and the wind moved through it without resistance, carrying dust and light across the line that had once tried to hold it back, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to claim, only the understanding that something had shifted, not finished, not resolved, but begun in a way that could not be undone. The gap in the fence did not look like much at first, just a missing board where wood had once forced a line across the land. But Aiyana could feel it, the difference, the way the wind no longer bent around it, but moved straight through, carrying dust and light without interruption, and she stood there watching that small opening as if it held more meaning than the miles stretching beyond it, because sometimes change did not arrive loud or wide. Sometimes it came in a space no wider than a hand. And she glanced at Elias, who had stepped back again after setting the board aside, his hands empty, his posture the same as it had always been, not claiming, not directing, just present. And she realized then that he was not trying to show her anything. He was simply allowing something to happen without stopping it. And that was different from every other man she had ever known on land like this. And she moved closer to the gap, crouching slightly, letting her fingers hover just above the ground where the fence line had once drawn its quiet division, and the dirt there felt no different from anywhere else, same dryness, same faint warmth from the sun, but the meaning of it had shifted, and she pressed her fingertips into it gently, not marking it, not claiming it, just acknowledging that it was there, and behind her, Elias remained still, watching without stepping in, without speaking, and after a moment, she stood again, brushing the dust from her hands slowly, her gaze lifting out across the open stretch where the land rolled wide and uninterrupted, and she said, almost to herself, "This is how it begins," and the words carried no certainty, no promise of what would come next, only the quiet understanding that something had already started and could not be returned to what it was before, and Elias nodded once, not because he knew where it would lead, but because he understood that beginnings did not need direction, they only needed space, and the sun had shifted lower now, casting longer shadows across the broken line of posts, stretching them thin across the ground until they no longer looked like barriers, just shapes fading into the distance, and Aiyana turned slightly, looking at him again, really looking, not for answers this time, not for truth he had already given, but for the man who had chosen to stand here without hiding behind what he had inherited, and she saw it clearly now, not strength in the way the world measured it, but something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself to exist, and she asked quietly, "What happens when others come?" And the question did not carry fear, it carried reality, because land like this did not remain unseen forever, and Elias took a slow breath, his eyes moving across the horizon as if he could already see what she meant. "They will see what we leave behind," he said, and the answer was simple, but it settled deep, because it was not about stopping what would come, it was about what would remain when it did, and the wind moved again, softer now, almost warm, carrying the scent of dry earth and something else, something that felt like possibility, and Aiyana realized that for the first time since she had stepped onto this land, she was not standing against it, and she was not standing apart from him. She was standing within something that was still being shaped, and for the first time, she did not feel the need to walk away. The light had begun to soften, stretching gold across the ridge and turning every shadow longer than it should have been, and Aiyana felt the shift not just in the sky, but in the space around them, the kind of quiet that comes when a day begins to settle into whatever it has become, and she stood there for a moment longer before turning away from the open land, her steps slow but certain as she moved along the broken line of fence posts, not following it, not respecting it, just walking beside it like it no longer held authority over where she could go, and Elias watched her for a second before falling into step a few feet behind, not beside her, not ahead, just keeping the distance she had chosen without question, and they walked that way for several yards, the sound of their boots against dry ground the only rhythm between them, until she stopped near one of the older posts. The wood split deep and worn smooth by years of wind and weather, and she reached out, running her fingers along the grain slowly, feeling the cracks that time had carved into it. And she said quietly, "This was not built in a day." And Elias shook his head slightly. "No, it was not." And she nodded, more to herself than to him. Because that truth mattered, because whatever had been done here had taken time, had been repeated, reinforced, believed in long enough to become something solid. And she turned to face him again, her expression steady. Not distant, not warm, just clear. "Then it will not be undone in a day either." And he met her gaze without hesitation. "No, it will not." And there was no frustration in his voice, no impatience, only acceptance, like a man who had already understood that some things could not be rushed without losing what made them right. And the wind moved between them again, lighter now, carrying the faint scent of water from the creek below, and Aiyana took a slow breath, letting it settle into her chest, because what she was stepping into was not a moment, it was a path, and paths did not ask for certainty, they asked for commitment. And she reached into her pouch once more, pulling out the small bead. Again, the one her mother had carried, the one that had outlived everything else. And this time she held it up slightly, not offering it, not explaining it, just letting it exist in the space where he could see it. "This is all that came back with me," she said, voice quiet but steady. And Elias did not reach for it, did not lean closer, he only looked, understanding without needing to be told that this was not an object. It was memory, it was weight, it was something that could not be replaced by paper or promise. And after a moment, she closed her hand around it again and slipped it back into place. And when she looked at him, there was something different now, not softer, not easier, but more grounded, as if she had decided where she stood, at least for now. And she said, "If we do this, it will not be for what was taken." And he listened, not interrupting, not anticipating. "It will be for what is still here," she finished, and the words settled between them like the first real foundation they had found, not built on apology, not built on ownership, but on something that existed regardless of either of them. And Elias nodded once, slow and certain, because that was something he could stand on without question, and the sun dipped lower behind them, casting their shadows forward across the open land, long and side by side, stretching into a distance neither of them could yet see the end of. The last of the light stretched thin across the horizon, fading into a muted blue that softened the edges of everything it touched, and Aiyana stood still for a moment, watching how the land changed when the sun stepped back, how it no longer demanded to be seen, but simply remained, quiet and certain in its place. And she felt something similar settle within her, not resolution, not peace, but a steadiness that had not been there before. And she turned slightly, her eyes moving back to Elias, who had not stepped away, who had not filled the silence with words that would have broken what had formed between them. And that restraint, that choice to let things stand as they were, carried more weight than anything he could have said. And she spoke slowly, measuring each word, not for effect, but for truth. "There will be others who will not understand this." And the statement did not carry doubt, it carried knowledge, because change did not arrive gently for everyone. And Elias nodded once, his gaze shifting toward the distant edge of the land where the horizon met the sky. "I know," he said, and there was no tension in his voice, no attempt to defend what could not yet be explained, only an acceptance that whatever they had begun would not remain untouched by the world beyond it. And she studied him carefully, watching for hesitation, for the small signs that might reveal uncertainty, but found none, only a quiet readiness that did not seek approval. And she asked, "And when they ask you what you are doing here, what will you say?" And the question settled between them with a weight that reached beyond this moment, beyond the ridge, into everything that might come next. And Elias took a slow breath, not to delay, but to ground himself in the answer, the truth. He said simply, and the words might have sounded small if they had come from anyone else, but from him they carried something deeper, something that did not need to be expanded to be understood. And Aiyana held his gaze for a moment longer, searching not for certainty, but for alignment. And when she found it, she nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in acknowledgement that this path, uncertain as it was, would be walked without disguise. And she turned then, her eyes moving once more across the land. But this time she did not see it as something taken or something to be returned. She saw it as something that existed beyond both, something that would remain long after their choices had settled into it, and she stepped forward, not away from him, but into the space they had opened together, her boots pressing into the ground with a quiet finality, and Elias followed, not beside her yet, but no longer behind, closing the distance just enough to show that he was not stepping into her path, only into the same direction, and as they moved, the shadows ahead of them stretched and merged, no longer separate lines, but one shape drawn across the land, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, only something left to live, and in that quiet, under a sky that no longer belonged to the day, Aiyana understood that what had begun here would not end with a single act or a single decision. It would continue in every step they chose to take from this moment forward, and for the first time, that did not feel like something to fear. The night settled slowly, not as darkness falling, but as light stepping back, leaving the land in a quiet gray that softened every edge, and Aiyana walked a few more steps before stopping again, not because she needed to, but because something in her told her this moment should not be rushed past, and she turned slightly, looking back across the ridge where the broken fence line now sat incomplete against the horizon, a line that had once tried to divide something that could not truly be divided, and she realized that what they had done was not large, not something others would notice at first glance, but it was enough to begin changing the shape of what stood here, and she felt that understanding settled deeper than anything spoken, because real change rarely announced itself. It simply began and waited to be recognized, and Elias stood beside her now, not behind, not ahead. The distance between them no longer measured in caution but in quiet agreement, and neither of them needed to speak to know that something had shifted into place, and after a moment, she said, almost to the land itself, "It will take time," and Elias nodded slightly, his gaze following hers across the darkening stretch of ground. "Yes," he said, and there was no weight of impatience in it, only the steady acceptance of someone who had already chosen to stay for as long as it would take, and the wind moved gently now, cooler than before, brushing past them with a softness that felt different from the dry gusts of the afternoon, and Aiyana reached into her pouch once more, her fingers finding the small bead again, but this time she did not take it out, she only held it there, feeling its presence as a reminder, not of loss, but of continuity, something carried forward without needing to be returned, and she looked at Elias again, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him clearly within everything she now knew, and she said, "There are stories my people stopped telling because no one believed they could still be true," and he listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, and she continued, quieter now, but maybe they were not meant to end, maybe they were only waiting, and the words lingered between them, not as hope, not as certainty, but as possibility, and Elias took a slow breath, the kind that settles a man into something he cannot yet see the end of. Then we do not let them stay quiet, either of them realizing it, and she looked out across the darkened stretch, no longer searching for what had been lost, no longer measuring what remained, just seeing it for what it was, open, quiet, unchanged in the way only land could be, and Elias came to a stop beside her, not speaking, not shifting, simply standing in the same direction, and for a long moment they stayed like that, two figures in the vastness, not defined by where they came from, not bound by what had been done before them, just present in a moment that did not belong to the past or the future, and Aiyana felt the weight of the day settle fully now, not heavy, not pressing, but complete, like something that had reached its end without needing to be closed, and she reached into her pouch one last time, her fingers finding the small bead again, and this time she took it out, holding it up where the faint starlight caught its worn surface, and she looked at it quietly, not with grief, not with longing, but with understanding, because it was no longer the only thing that connected her to what had been. It was simply a part of something larger that had found its way back into the world, and after a moment, she lowered her hand and stepped forward, moving to the edge where the ground met the slow curve toward the creek, and she crouched slightly, pressing the bead into the earth just enough for it to rest there without being buried, not hidden, not displayed, just placed where it could remain, and she rose again without looking back at it, because some things were not meant to be carried forever, some things were meant to be returned without ownership, And when she turned, Elias was watching, not questioning, not surprised, just understanding in the quiet way he always had. And she met his gaze for a brief second, and in that moment there was no distance left that needed to be measured, no line left that needed to be crossed. Only the shared recognition that whatever had begun here would not belong to either of them alone. And she stepped back beside him, her shoulders relaxed, her stance steady, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, and the wind moved softly across the land, passing through the broken fence line, across the open ground, over the place where the bead now rested, carrying no boundaries with it, no names, no claims, just the quiet presence of something that had always been there, waiting. And as they stood together under a sky that held no divisions, only distance and possibility, it became clear in a way that did not need words that this was not an ending, not a resolution, but a beginning that would continue long after they walked away, because out here, the land did not remember who owned it, only who chose to understand it. And for the first time, that was enough.